So Taliban today is a combination of these 5-6 different layers of Taliban. That's why, and people ask, how come they're all together? They're only together because they know that their survival is linked to their unity. Otherwise, in many cases, they're at each other's neck also.
Hello all, welcome to another episode of GNSI's Author Spotlight series. I am Dr. Arman Mahmoodian, a research fellow at the Global National Security Institute, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing the author of The Return of Taliban's Afghanistan After Americans Left, Dr. Hassan Abbas. Dr. Hassan Abbas, welcome to our show and our program. Dr. Abbas is a distinguished professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, known as NESA, based in Washington, D.C. In addition, he is a senior advisor to Harvard's Divinity College Project on Shiism and Global Affairs, and a non-resident fellow at the Institute for Social Understanding, a think tank which works on the issue of the Muslims in the United States. Previously, Dr. Abbas served as the department chair of the International Security Studies at the National Defense University. Dr. Abbas has authored various books, including Pakistan's The Nuclear Bomb, a story of the deterrence and deviance, the revival of the Taliban, violence and extremism on Afghanistan and Pakistan frontier, the Prophet's era, the story of life of the Ali ibn Abi Talib, and also the return of the Taliban. Today I'm here to talk about his book and the current state of the Afghanistan. Dr. Abbas, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much. Really honored and privileged to be with you.
Very kind of you. Dr. Abbas, I want to start this interview with an imaginary question, which doesn't make sense, but it opens up to a very important thing. If I tell you, bear in mind I said imaginary, I have a time machine and I can go back in time. And I can go back in time to before the collapse of Afghanistan, or the fall of the Afghanistan into the hands of Taliban. And I'm going to only be able to remove one of the reasons that you cited it as the collapse of Afghanistan in your book. In your book, you cited various reasons. The morale of Afghan troops was low. They had a high casualty prior to the collapse. They even were not get paid, as you talk in your book. The American support was withdrawn. The Afghani leadership, President Ashraf Ghani himself, wasn't as strong or effective as it was needed. There was a disagreement and dispute within the Afghanis high command. There were various reasons. But I have this machine, and I can only resolve one of these reasons. Resolving which of these would have saved Afghanistan, would have made Taliban to not be able to take over Afghanistan?
Thank you very much. It's a thoughtful question. I would still give kind of two reasons. One at a more big strategic level, and one which is more a practitioner's point of view. At a bigger strategic level, I would say it's about the clarity of mission, which is extremely important in such things. For United States and for NATO and for all the global powers who wanted change in Afghanistan, because we jumped from one missions to another, and clarity of mission often means you know of your resources, you know of your capability, you know the enemy well as well, you know the opponent well as well, person as well. We were sure about our resources. There was legitimate anger against Al-Qaeda because Taliban had supported them. So there were reasons. There was United Nations support. So there was clarity till that point. But then we kept on shifting. Initially, we said, we are here for getting rid of Al-Qaeda. Then we said, okay, we are doing state building. Or first we said nation building. When people said, no, this is a very old nation. You cannot do a nation building. We said, okay, no, we are doing state building. So this shifting mission, that's more of an academic, more philosophical answer. More specific answer from a practitioner's point of view is, I think, if we had done the transition quickly, we tried to, for probably most likely in a good-hearted way, because we were spending a lot of money. We were using US taxpayers' money. But we thought we will go for a very long time helping Afghanistan stand on its own feet. If we had done the transition to the Afghan government more quickly, leaving it into their hands, because at the end, we were constantly giving them final ultimatums, final deadlines, because US was offering 70% of their budget till the end. If we had done this early on, when Al Qaeda was kind of sidelined, they had run away from the scene, and we had started transitioning full power and authority to legitimate local Afghan leaders, I think they then had a better chance, those leaders and those Afghans, to push back Taliban. I think that if now in hindsight, it's much easier, of course, but a quick transition to representatives of Afghanistan who could have managed these things probably in a slightly better way. That would have given them authenticity, credibility, and they would have learned to walk. We thought we will hold their hand, and it became so long that Taliban were able to really get back into the game.
So if I stand correct, what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that for the most of the time, most of those 2 decades, United States was too protective of the Afghan government that they didn't let it grow naturally. And then it made a very quick withdrawal, which didn't let the Afghan government to get on its foot, to settle itself in the new position.
You have summarized it very well.
Wow. Thank you. Well, speaking of being quick, one of the things that comes, one of the arguments that still exists, debates that exists, which is kind of related to the withdrawal or quick withdrawal of the support or quick withdrawal from Afghanistan, is the negotiation part. The negotiation that Mr. Pompeo instructed and Mr. Khalilzad executed it. It's very arguable. And when you talk to the Afghanistan, the former officials, they actually blame negotiation and the fact that Afghan government been excluded as one of the reasons. They believe that caused a huge hit on their morale of the troops, that kind of gave legitimacy to Afghanistan. And obviously, the Americans have their own side. They, as you argued in your book, they tried to bring Ashraf Ghani on the table, but he was, I think you even used the term stubborn at some point, to compromise. What exactly happened? If our audience and me, do you want a very fair and objective take on that? What happened during that? To what extent the problem was Americans and the problem was, or to what extent was also Afghanistan?
Thank you. Extremely important question. I'll have to give a very little background to it. When Taliban were initially shunted out right after the 9/11 tragic attacks, and we had the Bonn conference where all the Afghan diaspora, Afghan leaders were there, Taliban were kept out. So they were initially, we were a bit stubborn. We said, we are not going to include even some of the relatively moderate Taliban into the conversation. Then Karzai, within few years, President Hamid Karzai, elected president and a very, very good friend of the United States to begin with, kept on saying, let me talk to Taliban. And we had enough evidence on the US side that no, Taliban had done this intentionally, in a sense that it was a policy decision to provide sanctuary to Al Qaeda. We should not be talking to them. And that's a very important time when Hamid Karzai says it publicly that he wanted to talk to Taliban. This took.
So Americans were against him.
Americans' side was saying, yes, there was reluctance on this part as well. But Hamid Karzai, it's a good question. Some of the people on the ground were saying, no, there's no need to talk. We need to teach them a lesson. And one understands that because that we had a complete military approach. However, by 2012, almost 10 years in this whole war, President Obama is the one who first gave a go-ahead that let's start talking to them. And a special office was created in Doha. About 20, ultimately 30 to 35 families of Talibans were brought in along with their families in Doha because we said we want some Taliban who are relatively moderate. I'm using this word. Maybe at that time
comparable to the rest. Yeah.
Let's talk to them. Let's have a channel. And this is the same pattern we have seen with Hamas, that we have seen with other people as well, groups as well. And that's conversation started, but they fizzled out because Taliban were insistent, we want to be called the Emirate of Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. I'll jump to the next stage. So there was this stages of negotiation attempts or attempts for dialogue at various places. Ultimately, US realized whenever we even give approval for some conversations and negotiations, either Karzai is too at times flexible, at other times he's too protective of his own power. He wants to micromanage, keeping US out, because Karzai also deteriorated in terms of his relationship with US deteriorated over time. So US, there was increasing lack of trust in Karzai as well. We came to a point
toward the Karzai or in Karzai toward the Americans?
both sides, both sides. And one of the reasons from if you ask Karzai, he will tell you, well, US military and NATO and ISAF was operating. ISAF, this was a collection of the Western forces, that they were conducting too many night raids, which meant there was too many civilian casualties. And Hamid Karzai was saying, you are not involving the political government in Kabul. You are making military decisions, which might be necessary, but you are taking the rug from under our feet. And I'm losing credibility because Taliban are now reacting. To cut the long story short, that's a point also. Then many Taliban had found sanctuary in Pakistan. They were in Pakistan-Afghanistan border region. They were in Quetta. They had a Quetta Shura of Taliban. So the Pakistani support, whether it's you call it military intelligence support, you also call it tribal support, that was also there. Ultimately, United States came to a point when they said, okay, we have spent $1 trillion on this. We have tried every different version of dialogue and negotiation. It's not working. Let's cut out everyone. Afghan government in Kabul, Pakistan, let's talk to Taliban directly. And that's when those who were now well settled in Doha, US started talking to them directly. It seems, and that is something that took everyone by surprise. Pakistan said, we are a major regional power. How can you keep us out? Kabul said, how can you have negotiations with Taliban without us? But US took a policy decision. You have to give credit where due. President Trump had said at that time, everything that was possible we have done. Nothing is working out. We need to talk directly to Taliban so that they take care of our core interest, which was security interest. At the end of the day, American interest was, we don't want a sanctuary of terrorists of all kinds in Afghanistan, sanctuary that can be used to conduct another, God forbid, 9/11 kind of attack. And US said, let's talk to Taliban, talk to them. We'll leave it open to you. If you, whatever your engagement with Kabul is, if you win over, it was not said in these many words, but this was the implication. But US said, our interest is you will not allow this Afghanistan to become a terrorist sanctuary. And everyone was surprised how prepared. This was a new Taliban outlook. Taliban were very well prepared. They at times would make mistakes, take out or mention mistakes in the draft document that was being negotiated. Many US military generals sat in those conversations, and there were very emotional moments because both sides had lost people. Taliban, that's the biggest surprise that came for US and for all US allies. How Taliban had grown over a period of time, how they had used the opportunity in Doha to have more exposure, how they have how well prepared they were. And that's when those negotiations happen. The big now controversial part is, and I'll stop there, the controversial part is Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad was given a clear contract, or he was given a clear authority, go and negotiate with Taliban. We don't want any terrorist threat coming out of Taliban. Whatever you have to give in return, give it. And Ashraf Ghani, who was the president then, he said, you are just making this terrible for us. And US response to Ashraf Ghani was, which I think was a legitimate response, you had so much time. We kept on telling you, you are getting 70% of your budget from us. We have been telling you, where is your CT policy? Where is your local popularity or your support base? Where is your governance? If you keep on asking for 1 more year, 2 more years, US taxpayers' money is being spent. So there's clarity of mission. This was not the initial mission we had. If that was my point to your earlier question, if we had followed that mission statement in the first 3 to 4 years and handed over things to Afghan government, they had the time to create their credibility. Now we were at a point in 2017-18, Kabul had lost credibility, corruption was rampant, incompetence was all over the place. Taliban had become far more powerful, partly because of their sanctuary in Pakistan and support from there, partly because of their own smart strategy. And that's when we were able to cut that deal. Mistakes were committed. I'll mention only one mistake in those negotiations. The day we forced Kabul to release 5,000 people who were the hardcore terrorists or Taliban extremists. And we forced Ashraf Ghani, release them. That was the day people within Afghanistan stopped their kind of, they lost their hope. They thought, okay, Americans have, or Western forces have cut a deal. That's when the tribal dynamic in the region is such that they read it, oh, Americans are leaving. And they knew everything they had was because of US equipment, military, training, air support, everything was dependent on US. So that message was interpreted in a way which is, if we had read any history book, we should have known Taliban will be back, because as soon as one group is seen losing international support, the opponents will say, okay, now it's an equal battle and we'll beat the hell out of them. And that's what Taliban were ready to do.
I have a quick follow-up question. Whose idea was to go and negotiate with Taliban directly without anybody's participation? Was it Khalilzad's?
No, I think Khalilzad was given this task. I think it was President Trump. To the best of my knowledge and all the works that I've read, there were some other renowned diplomats who had recommended this approach in 2012 and 13.
During Obama, President
During
Obama.
Obama years. So the idea was not new. That's why people were brought in Doha. I mean, a credit goes equally to President Obama's administration as well. If there was no office of Taliban in Doha, we had nobody to negotiate with. So we had created a space for ourselves also with a group of Taliban through whom we could access Taliban leadership. Otherwise, let's say if there was no Doha space in Doha, Pakistan would have micromanaged it. Pakistan would have said, okay, we'll bring people to a table. Pakistan would have squeezed them in their own way. So it was a smart move. I would give credit in a different sense. I mean, those who are opposed to negotiations will say, what credit? What I'm saying is, for US to have come up with a deal, it was necessary to have a place in Doha. And that decision was taken in 2012. So responsibility or credit or blame, whatever we call it, has to go equally to President Obama's administration as to President Trump's first administration.
Thank you. You mentioned about there was an idea from the very beginning, and Hamid Karzai was enforcing it, to bring the so-called moderate or comparably moderate faction of Taliban. And this is actually one of the things that in this book, which is, by the way, there is a new edition of it too, you argued and you mentioned that there is a wrong perception of Taliban among the most people. And they think Taliban is harmonious, very unified and simple organization that its leaders just wear white and black and that's it. But in your book, actually you say that it is complex, it's multi-layered, it has different factions. There is an actually rivalry between the Haqqani network and the current leadership, Hekmatyar, Habibullah, over who would be the leader. You mentioned the rule of Sirajuddin Haqqani. So I want to ask you a question. First, I want you, if it is possible, to kind of elaborate on the dynamic of the Taliban. And the second, if tomorrow, for any reason, United States feel the need to kind of negotiate and deal, cooperate with one of these factions in Taliban, which one would be the most, I correct my question, the least dangerous or unreliable one to deal with it among all of those factions?
Another very good question. I want to remind your audience as well that Taliban started off as a movement which was a reactionary movement. a movement that was a consequence of 20 years of war. This is about people from a country who were steeped in tribalism. Warfare was their norm. Everyone is well equipped, everyone knows how to use weapons. The terrain is such that once these forces would go to mountains, they can fight any military. And they had shown that with against the British in 19th century, against the Soviet Union 40 years or so ago, and now because they know their ways into these mountains. So this was a movement which had that support network. Now, when I say multi-layered, you picked the right word, because there were, like many other movements, there are always some people who are hardcore, in this case, hardcore ideologues, who were very rigid and, in my understanding, very extremist Muslims in a sense. Linked to this group are those who are the foot soldiers, who may not know the intricacies of Deobandi, Hanafi, Sunni Islam, but they knew that this is what their leaders are and this what they are saying is the real Islam. And unlike in other regional locations, in this case specifically, it's tribalism which is so deeply interlinked with Islam. Many of the components of how Afghanistan looks at Islam are actually their tribal norms. For example, a certain way of parda or hijab that the women would do. The role of women. It's not Islamic per se, but it is very, very tribal, which is linked to their culture.
So it's ethical, ethnical.
Ethnic also, absolutely, because the most Pashtuns were part of the Taliban. So there's one, this hardcore ideologues, the other one, foot soldiers who are more tribal. Then there are drug lords. They also have beards and they have turbans, and an ordinary person cannot differentiate. And with drug lords comes the organized criminal gangs, who are very well entrenched as well. Then there's a fourth category of those Taliban who actually were coming from across the border in Pakistan, where they were born and raised. They were initially Afghans, but they had grown up in Pakistan. So these are some of the varieties. And then only one more variety. Within the ethnic Pashtuns also, there's this south and east. In Kandahar. Kandahar had been the hub of Pashtun nationalism also at one time, but now Taliban as well. But in the east, from where Sirajuddin Haqqani and the Haqqanis come, is slightly different area. Their tactics, their ways, their resources, their networking is different. So Taliban today is a combination of these 5-6 different layers of Taliban. That's why, and people ask, how come they're all together? They're only together because they know that their survival is linked to their unity. Otherwise, in many cases, they're at each other's neck also.
Wow. And which one United States can work with?
Very good question. It is not an easy question. I think already some Taliban factions are trying to reach out to US and other international organizations as well, trying to say, talk to us. For example, and the most interesting among them is Sirajuddin Haqqani, who was on our FBI's most a top terrorist list. We had a lot of money on his head. But now it is believed that he was able to go to Saudi Arabia for Hajj and also to some other countries in the region, to UAE as well, because United States gave a go-ahead, or at least looked the other way. Without US approval, there's no way Haqqani could have gone there. Haqqani, I went in the part of my research, I realized for the paperback of this book has a new chapter where one of my very close friends was able to go to Haqqani and interview him, which says that Haqqani is actually, and his family, who are traditionally known to have excellent network in UAE also. Some of their family cousins of, actually younger brother of Sirajuddin Haqqani is married into a very influential UAE family. They always had developed their networks through their marriages, alliances as well.
Is it because of the Arab Bureau during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan?
Partly that, and partly because that's how they had survived over generations, through marriage alliances in that region. They have been trying to reach out to some Western countries, including United States. Siraj Haqqani, who's the interior minister also, Uh, he has been saying we need training for the customs officials of Afghanistan. We need support for our law enforcement. Who's ready to help us? He has been trying to reach out to US for that as well. Of course, he's on a different side, but he's pitting himself, or he's projecting himself and his family as the one who's open to dialogue. And this becomes very interesting because Hibatullah, the supreme leader, is who's sitting in Kandahar, who's now the most powerful man, is no more just an ideologue. Many people have started comparing him with Khamenei in Iran because of Iran is also the model of Iranian governance pattern is also influencing some Taliban as well, because Hibatullah thinks he's as powerful as the supreme leader in Iran is, at least in terms of model. And there's some engagement between Afghanistan and Iran as well, unlike the older era. Hibatullah, who's the supreme commander or the supreme leader, he calls himself Amir al-Mu'mineen. I have a big issue with that. I mean, that's a very sacred title in Islamic history. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry cannot pick up Amir al-Mu'mineen and starts calling him. But he's very rigid. He's very much against dialogue. He believes in no opening with the Western world. So in that's kind of dark side of Taliban, which is very ideological. And ideological even is a wrong word. I, in my book, have made a case that some of them, it's more like a cult now rather than any Islamic movement. In this scenario, Siraj Haqqani looks like a moderate. He's not.
He's a practical.
He's pragmatic. There's a lot of American blood on his hands. He was involved in popularizing the suicide bombing campaign. So it's not easy to talk to him because many things will come back to haunt us in terms of our memory in US. But he's more pragmatic. And many of those cabinet members sitting in Kabul are pragmatic. The problem is also of the way we in US and in the Western world, we projected Taliban. We projected them as cavemen, unorthodox, uncouth. No, the reality is some of the cabinet members in Afghanistan are graduates from top universities. Top university is not the right word, from normal secular schooling. They're 2 PhDs. They have some diversity in them within what is possible. Those in Kabul, I think many of them really want to engage because they know their survival is engagement.
So if I stand correct, and when the way that you distinguish the Haqqani from Ayballah, and in book you actually talk about Taliban went through 3 different stages of evolution. The first stage, then which is pre-2009-11, and then the insurgency, and then the new Taliban, which they took, which kind of the negotiation mapped them out. The third stage seems to want to appear or operate as a state. I mean, I went and even, I'm not an expert of Afghanistan, but it is in the realm that I like to study. I went and I'm actually dedicating time on my daily base or weekly base to watch video propagandas that come from them, YouTube and other places. And you would see that they really like to show off their special operation forces. They really like to function as a state, as a professional statesmanship. So I don't know, that's a different story. The way that I appear doesn't mean that the way that I am. But is it safe to conclude that it is Haqqani's faction of the Taliban that tries to function as a state, but Habibullah and the older school or vanguard still tries to keep it in a tribal way of leadership?
That's well said, almost like that. Although now we know that Hibatullah, the supreme commander, is also giving a go-ahead on various things. He has built his own security force for himself, but he has his own representatives in every ministry. So he approves of the system the way it is working. It is only that he's very rigid when it comes to, from his point of view, any compromise on what he sees as the Islamic principles. So he's more rigid. But Afghanistan, I mean, honestly, whether we like it or not, Afghanistan is functioning as a state. And we are not acknowledging them for our own reasons of international law and because there are various then implications of that. But no one was expecting them to survive 3 years. I mean, not that I would like to say that I was right, but I was saying from day one, the way they have negotiated, the way they have taken hold of Afghanistan, the way they got support base in all parts of Afghanistan, and even in areas of Tajiks and Uzbeks, they show that they mean business. They have learned their lessons. They have some smart people pursuing their interests, and we need to take them more seriously. And no one will be able to get rid of them in next 5 to 7 years. So they have 3 years on. I don't see them on the way out in next 3 to 5 years.
So first, we didn't have clarity in mission, and today we don't have clarity in assessment.
Yes, now we are slightly better in assessment. Yes. We are increasingly leading American, or many American scholars are saying, engage with them, talk to them. Even some are saying, recognize them. Because we are good at learning lessons. So we are in a much better shape today dealing with Afghanistan in terms of our assessment than 20 years ago.
Thank you. You mentioned that many people thought the Taliban would survive 3 years, which they survived. They still control a good chunk of the country. There are some reports recently. I believe one of them was one for Financial Times. But in general, we are hearing that the influence and authority of Taliban over some section of the country may fade. And that is due not the resistance, but actually something more vicious and dangerous, the Islamic State of the Khorasan, ISIS-K. And we have seen, I think it was just last week that ISIS-K conducted a bombing operation, or they planted an explosive alongside the road and killed four or three Taliban security officers. To what extent do you think these reports hold true? To what extent do you think these are emotional? To what extent, let me rephrase it in that way, you think Taliban can sustain the current status quo in Afghanistan, assuming there is no foreign intervention in Afghanistan?
I think Taliban will sustain. And the ISK threat is there. They have been conducting series of attacks and suicide bombings throughout, but they pose no existential threat to Taliban. They can conduct terrorist attacks. This Daesh or ISK is not from outside. These are many folks who were earlier part of the Taliban. They were the extremists. There's some from Pakistani militant extremist, sectarian militant groups from Pakistan who have also joined in. So they are a threat. We should take them seriously because their worldview is different. They want a khilafat. Taliban, historically, we know, wanted only control in Afghanistan. Although Hibatullah at times give an impression that he is a leader of all Muslims or things like that. But I think he'll face reality sooner than later. But ISK is a threat, but at this time, not a serious threat to a point that they can dislodge Taliban. But Taliban, and that's why, actually, that's one area of potential Taliban cooperation, coordination with Western forces, because we don't want ISK. ISK is the new baddest option or the worst terrorists. That's what I think.
So now that we cover that, we like it or not, they are in a state, they function as a state, but are they a popular state?
They are not popular because of the policies that they are pursuing. Girls are not going to school. Minority communities, the Hazara Shia, are in severe distress. If you are not a Pashtun, you are on their target list. So it's at this moment, they are only trying to benefit their foot soldiers. So the human rights side of things, it's terrible. There's an environmental degradation also, the river waters, others, but that is not of Taliban's doing. What Taliban are doing is that they are scaring people again. Initially, they gave the impression, because they were international journalists, they were trying to give a different impression. Increasingly, they are becoming very, very more showing their dogmatic sign, influenced by Kandahar more so. But the way, especially what's happening to women education and the whole women taken out of the jobs and small girls not going to school, I think that is something which is not popular at all. So Taliban, if there's an open election today, I don't think Taliban will majority. They'll get most votes apparently at this time, maybe 35 to 40% maximum. But they are not going to win an election in an open election. That's I understand.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I have one quick question, and it's going to be the final question. And I really appreciate your insights. Dr. Abbas, between you and me and our audience, was the return of Taliban inevitable? Was it Afghanistan doomed to be governed by them again?
Not really, not in this way.
Not in this way.
We could have done better. And I have often said this, $1 trillion, I have to be very candid and honest. $1 trillion would have converted the whole of Afghanistan into a beautiful garden. We could have done better. We could have learned from our lessons on the go. We were trying to learn on the fly. And every problem doesn't need a hammer or a military option. And I say this being a security official and working for Department of Defense, and very proud of that. But there are these soft approaches through cultural means, through negotiations, through seeing things on the time, on the moment, not going, because once the violence becomes the norm, then the opponent also uses violence. And then there's no commonality or common point. So we could have used the money in a far more effective way. I think it was this realization in Washington, D.C., which forced us to opt for negotiations. We realized it.
You realized it?
I think so.
So at least we learned a lesson.
I sincerely hope that this optimistic view is accurate.
Thank you, Dr. Abbas. Thank you for your insights. And thank you for being with us. But before letting you go, I want to ask you one last favor. Please go to the caption of this video at the bottom of this video, and you will find a link to Dr. Abbas's book in the Amazon. Order it and enjoy it. Thank you very much. Wish you a great day.